The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome to the first of the 6 Lunch and Learn webinars. So welcome to you wherever you are in Australia. I just want to make sure that I'm being heard, and the best way to do that, and if I familiarise you with the system, I would like to do that. So if you look over on the right-hand side, you'll notice that there's a little box there that says questions. Could I just ask you to open that up, and could I ask you to type in the word clear? Now, if you do that, that will help me know that I'm coming across loud and clear. Thanks, Caroline. I appreciate that, and welcome to. Thanks, John. Welcome to you. Thanks, Fraser. I think you're from Brisbane, Fraser. I'm obviously in Brisbane as well. Thanks, Dominique. Thanks, Megan. Welcome as well. All right, sounds like I am coming across loud and clear. Now, the point I want to make there is that you can, at any stage you've got a question or you've got a comment that you'd like to make in relation to anything that I run through, that's the place to type it in. So the idea is that you can type that question in, and I'm the only one that gets to see it. So in other words, I'll see it and then I'll respond to it as soon as I see it, or as soon as possible. The reason for that is that if we leave it till the end and we've got sort of 10 minutes of awkward silence, it just means that maybe nobody's got anything that they want to ask, and we have that wasted opportunity. So I think when it's fresh in your mind, just go ahead and type in the question, and I'm sure that I can deal with it right there and then. So warm welcome to you all. A few little other important things before we get underway. Each time we have a Lunch and Learn webinar, you will receive a copy of the recording and slides. So keep your eyes peeled, because you'll get an email from me, not today because I've got back-to-back meetings, but I intend to send this out over the weekend. So if you check in your inbox, you'll find that there is a copy of the slides and the recording. So that's convenient for you, I guess, if you can't attend. So for example, you've got a meeting and you just can't get out of that meeting, but you want to catch up on that. Well, all you have to do is go to that email and just click on whether it's the slides or the recording, so you'll get all that. The other thing, of course, is that I have the remaining webinars in there, so I'll have obviously the next 5. So if you haven't actually registered for all 5, could I ask you to do that? I know it's a pain in the neck, because you put your name in and your email address and you think, well, why do I have to keep doing that 5 times? Well, unfortunately, the system actually recognizes it as 6 webinars rather than one series of webinars. So you just go through, it's not too onerous. Now, why would I want you to do that? The reason is that you then get some automated emails to remind you. So you'll get an email a day before, and you'll also get another automated email an hour before. The other thing you can do, of course, is put these emails into your calendar so that they're, a dedicated slot of time of an hour every couple of weeks where you can tune into this. So it is important to register for that reason, but regardless, you'll get a copy of the slides and recording. Okay, so that's about it. Now, the only other thing I'd have to say to you is that I will be giving you homework at the end of each session. It's not onerous. I'm just simply going to give you things I want you to try. Now, you can obviously see that our topic today is on feedback, so clearly it's going to be something to do with giving feedback. And I want you to have a go at it. In other words, what happens between the sessions is very important. And we have a couple of weeks between each of the topics, and the reason for that is it gives you a couple of weeks to go away and try some things, but it's not too long for you to have completely forgotten about what we've covered. So there's a couple of good reasons for doing that. So that's about it for me as far as the housekeeping and administrative side of things goes. So let's get stuck into it, and let's start looking at the program in its entirety. So you can see that on this screen, and there's always a little bit of a delay. There it is, it's on your screen now. You'll notice that over on the left-hand side, we've got all the topics. And I'll just sort of give you a quick overview of those topics. Obviously, I'll be covering them in more detail when I get to them. I won't touch number one because we're going to be into that very shortly. But next time we meet, which is 2 weeks away, we're going to look at enhancing your personal influence. Now, and it's purely optional, but you can, and it's also part of the cost of you registering, you can complete an influencing capabilities profile, which I've actually put together in one of my books. And you can complete that online, and I'll send the link to you at the end of this with the slides and recording. And you can do that in preparation for Unit 2. So what that actually does is show you your preferred style of influence. How do you like influencing other people? And then, of course, what we're going to be covering in Unit 2 is how we can broaden that so that we can improve your influencing capability, because obviously that's the business that you and I are in. We're all in the business of influencing. We're either being influenced or we're influencing other people. So keep your eyes peeled for that diagnostic. You can also do it after the next session if you choose to do it that way. Now, in session 3, we're going to look at optimizing team performance. We've got a whole series on Lunch and Learn for team leaders, but what I'm really looking at here is how do you actually go about getting that little extra discretionary effort from your team, which isn't always easy to do, of course. But, you know, I've got a few tips and hints on how we might do that. In Unit 4, we're going to talk more about the individual, and that is how do you get the best from the people that you lead. Now, the way I look at this is that if you could rate a person's performance out of 10 and you gave them a 4 out of 10, it's probably unrealistic to think that you could get them to a 10 out of 10. But it's not unrealistic for you to get them from a 4 to a 5. And so what I'm looking for there is that extra little, discretionary effort that exponentially would make a huge difference. In other words, if everyone in your team was improving by 10%, that's going to give you a significant difference in terms of productivity. So I'm going to be sharing with you a lot of the models and motivational theories that are out there, the ones that I know are reputable and the ones that I know are practical and easy to apply. So we'll go through that. In Unit 5, we're going to do another diagnostic, but this will be a paper one, and this is understanding people and your personality. I dare say many of you have done MBTI and you've done DISC and you've done many of these sorts of things as part of your employment. This is a slightly different one, and what I want to do is really just sensitize you to the fact that everyone's different and we've all got different ways that we like to be communicated to. So this is about communicating it more effectively to the various different personality types. So we'll go through that in Unit 5. And in Unit 6, I think it's a very important but often underestimated title, and that is around facilitating effective meetings. The reality is this is a meeting, and as soon as this is finished, you've got another meeting, and then another meeting. Our life just is an endless series of meetings. So the question then is, are you running your meetings as effectively as you possibly can? I'm sure we've all been to many meetings that meander and they don't get to the point and they're unproductive. And of course, they cost money, serious money, because, you've got 6 people in a room and you're there for an hour, you work out the hourly rate and, that's just the starting point. There's another hour that's lost because they're not working on a project or something else. So in actual fact, a meeting of 6 people in a room, including yourself, is actually 12 hours of productive time. And if you multiply that by the hourly rate of people and you consider how many meetings that you have over a year, that becomes a reasonably scary number. And so it is important that people actually learn to facilitate effective meetings. But it's surprising how little people do in terms of being effective at facilitating meetings. So we're going to look at a few things that have worked well for me in the past, I've seen and maybe I've done. I know they work, so I'll be giving you some practical tips on making your meetings even more effective than they currently are. So that's it, and that's the program. So let's get stuck into the Unit 1 and start to look at this whole interesting topic of feedback and consider some of the key issues that go with that. So I want to start by just simply giving you this quote from John Allen, and I guess it sort of sums up feedback for a lot of people. But here's the quote, and that is that if annual reviews are the only time when feedback's given, that's a problem. But it's certainly better than nothing. So I find that a lot of managers and team leaders and so on, what they tend to do is to save up their feedback for performance review time. And that's not a very good strategy because, first of all, there's probably a whole lot of feedback that you could give. Secondly, you probably won't fit it all into the meeting anyway. And thirdly, you've probably forgotten a lot of the feedback that's useful anyway along the way. So it's not a good idea for lots of reasons. And in fact, I think sometimes performance reviews actually encourage managers not to give feedback rather than to give feedback because they just wait for the review. My suggestion is that you should be giving feedback moment by moment, project by project, situation by situation, day by day, and so on and so on. It never ends. In fact, every single day, there should be some form of feedback that you're giving. There's two types of feedback, of course. There's positive feedback. That is, people are exceeding expectations. And there is, of course, constructive feedback, and that is where people are not. I don't like the word negative feedback because it's actually should be constructive feedback. In other words, these are things that you can work on to improve, and as a result of that, you're giving them feedback. So we're going to start with positive feedback. So your homework is going to be very much around giving positive feedback. And then once you get the hang of that, I'm going to suggest you give more feedback in different ways. Now, I've got some very sobering statistics for you, or information and data that's been collected from a series of surveys. And you can see it on your screen there, and I just run through it with you. And I guess I'm setting the scene to say we're not giving enough feedback, basically. That's the reality of it. So if you have a look over there on the left-hand side, 60% of employees don't understand their organisational goals. Now, that basically means that there's only a minority of people that know and can link the work that they do with the goals of the organisation. So that's a bit of a worry because obviously if you've got the majority of people that don't know what the organisational goals are, or the unit goals or department goals or whatever it might be, then obviously you've got a situation where people are probably working on the wrong thing at the wrong time and even in the wrong way. So that becomes problematic in terms of productivity. 87% of employees aren't engaged in the work they do. And actually, worse than that, 20% of people are actively disengaged. In other words, they're trying to undermine the organisation and the work that's being done. Now, I've seen surveys around this 70%, 87, whatever. The bottom line is most people in the workplace are not engaged. And that really is very disturbing because obviously if people aren't engaged, and we all know what we mean by engaged, they show energy, they're involved in the work they do, they enjoy the work, they go out of their way to find solutions to problems and all the rest of it. Now, if the majority of people aren't like that, then we've got a problem in terms of productivity. There is a very strong body of evidence that's emerging that feedback and engagement go hand in hand. So in other words, if you give people a lot of feedback, assuming of course you do it right, but you give people a lot of feedback and that's both positive and constructive, you're likely to engage people far more. So, and we'll look at that in a bit more detail in a moment. 77% of employees say that their performance would improve with more feedback. All right, so basically the people on the receiving end are saying that if they got more feedback, they would feel more engaged and perhaps improve their performance. So giving feedback can increase engagement by 60%. Now you might say to me, well, I'm not receiving much feedback from my boss, and that may well be true. And perhaps that's something that you should talk to them about, not in a sort of defensive way, but just to sort of encourage them to broach those subjects with you. But just because they're not giving that to you does not give you a license not to actually give the feedback to the people that you lead. In fact, I think it's all the more reason to do it, because you understand how deflating it can be not knowing how you're going. 50% of managers fail to hold their team members accountable and have the hard conversation. That's, in my experience, working across 21 industries, I think that's very, very true. So people sweep it under the carpet, they don't deal with it, and of course it doesn't magically improve. So it is very important that we continually have those courageous conversations, as I call them, when they need to be made, and that's feedback. 57% of employees say that they want the critical feedback that helps them improve. So the majority of people are saying, I want feedback, I want constructive feedback, I want to know whether I'm meeting the necessary requirements of my boss. The majority of people are like that, and it's human nature. If you think about it, humans need to know where they stand. That's why we have rules and regulations, systems and processes and procedures. All of those things are giving us a clarity around what's appropriate and what's inappropriate. We don't always like, or perhaps I should put it another way, we don't always receive the feedback the way we should, particularly when it's constructive feedback, but we all need it. And this is the big distinction. People need it, but they might not necessarily like it. But basically, when 57% of people say that, they're saying they need it. Whether they accept it or not is another thing. So if you've got any questions, comments, observations, go for your life. You know what to do. Go to that question box, type in your question, and I can assure you I will certainly respond to it. So have a look at this very simple, I guess you'd call it a chart or a bar graph. Now, if you look at the blue is positive and the red is negative. So if you look at the top bar, it says that if people only ever receive positive feedback, that is, there's no negative feedback at all, and all they get is positive encouragement and thank yous and that sort of thing, then it's likely that you as a leader will engage that team, all things being equal, of course. So by doing that, you're actually engaging people. So if for no other reason, just to be giving positive feedback is a smart move. Now, where it gets interesting is in the next two bars. That probably doesn't surprise you, the first result. But if you're only ever giving critical feedback, or what we might call constructive feedback, you will still have a fairly engaged team. So basically what that's saying is you're fulfilling a need that people have, and that is to know where they stand with you. Okay, not quite as encouraging as the top bar, but the obvious message is if you give positive and constructive feedback, you're likely to get an engaged team. And what's interesting in this is the last bar, if you don't give any feedback at all, or very, very little, then you're likely to disengage people. That's very important. So you have no choice. You've got to give feedback. And if you give feedback, whether it's positive or constructive, it's likely that you will engage people more so than perhaps was the case. So I'm trying to make the point here, the link between engagement and, of course, feedback. So, okay, with all of that in mind, let's move on and let's look at perhaps a couple of other issues before we launch into the characteristics of giving feedback, what's important. So, roughly by a 3-to-1 margin, employees believe that constructive feedback does more to improve their performance than positive feedback. So in other words, people are asking for feedback when they're not doing it right. They want it. Now, it's one thing, I guess, to say, I need it or I want it. It's another thing that when it's given, that they accept it in the vein that it's given, and sometimes that's not the case. And what happens then is leaders get confused and think, well, that didn't work. Maybe I shouldn't be giving them that feedback. So look, and I think the key thing about all of this is that the secret to having an employee listen to your feedback is basically whether or not they respect you. You could give the most factually correct feedback, but if that person does not respect you as a manager, then it's likely that it's going to fall on deaf ears. Now, this whole Lunch and Learn series is actually going to help you gain that respect and what we might call authenticity. So everything that we do is about that. But, and just to make my point, respect is earned, and it's incredibly hard to get, as I'm sure you're aware, and it requires you to be authentic. So if there's one thing that I would ask you to consider is just being a normal human being. Be authentic. And authentic means that you make mistakes, you accept that you make mistakes, you perhaps even acknowledge that and apologize for it, that you just, if you don't know the answer, then you say, I don't know the answer to that, but I'm willing to look into it, all of that kind of thing. That's all about authenticity. Now, what's interesting is that if you could have this exactly the same feedback to two different people, and you'll have completely different effects. So person A says, oh, wow, okay, I probably need to pull my head in. So that person takes on board your feedback, but person B ignores the feedback. And a lot of that has to do with the extent to which those individuals respect you, not just as a human being, but as a leader, as a manager. And, so as I said, we're going to be covering a lot of things. And if you apply some of these things, that respect will be forthcoming, even though perhaps it's not there right now. And of course, employees got a responsibility as well in this regard, but we'll talk more about that later. Now, one of the things I want to broach is managing expectations. Now, when you have expectations, and you all do, of course, you do, and I do, when you have expectations of other people, it's quite a complex thing. It's not a simple thing of just blurting out something that you want and expect everyone will go off and do it. It's quite an interesting phenomenon. And in fact, there are 7 key questions that I'd like you to ask yourself in the process of managing expectations. And if any of these questions can't be answered in the positive, then it's probably likely that you're missing the answer to that question. So what's the basic question here? Whoop, I went too far there, but 2. Let me go back to 1. Okay, so the very first question that you should be able to ask, or should be able to answer, I should say, is what are your expectations as a leader? Are you absolutely crystal clear about what you expect of your team members? Now, you might say that's a bit of a strange question because people should know that. Well, yes and no. I've come across leaders that can't really confidently respond well to, all the, if I ask people, I know you're in the business of report writing. So what is the minimum acceptable standard of performance that you expect in report writing? Could you answer that question? Or in terms of engaging with clients or customers, could you give a minimum acceptable standard of performance? These are questions that maybe aren't so easy to answer, but obviously if you can't answer those, then you're not able to then communicate those expectations to other people. But on the assumption that you are clear about that, the next key question out of the 7 is this: have you communicated those expectations to your team? Now you might say to me, yeah, well, I had a team meeting the other day and I communicated what I expected. And no, you've got to do it. You've got to do it all the time. It's never ending. It's moment by moment, project by project. It is done collectively. It's also done individually. It's done formally and informally. You must continue to talk about your expectations, because the proof of this is if I went up to your people and I said, tell me, what is the expectations your leader has of you? Would you be confident in their response? Would you be confident that they would blurt out exactly what your expectations were? I guess is the key question. Now, let's assume that you know what your expectations are. Let's assume that you've communicated them. Surely that's all that matters. No, we've still got many, many other issues before we get to that point. The next question we've got to ask is, does your team understand your expectations? Now, you might think I'm splitting hairs here, but the reality is when you explain expectations, sometimes people just don't get what they are. Now, and of course, they're not likely to say to you, I don't understand what your expectations are. I don't understand what you expect of me. Now, if people, they just don't say that. They just walk away in a daze and they hope like heavens that they've actually got the right interpretation of what you've mentioned. So you get the impression that when you actually communicate this to other people, that they completely understand what you mean because you've had no negative feedback. You might even ask, is that clear? And they say yes. And you think, end of story, they should know. But obviously, if people don't understand it, then it's highly unlikely that they're going to engage with it. So let's assume that you know what your expectations are. Let's assume you've communicated them. Let's assume that your team members actually understand those expectations. Surely that's the end of it. No, we've still got more here. Do your team members accept those expectations? Now, the reality is that people are being bombarded left, right, and centre. And as the great management consultant said, Warren Bennis, the biggest challenge of the 21st century for all of us is the management of distraction. We're being distracted and pulled and pushed in all sorts of directions from all sorts of things. Sometimes we might actually prioritise and think, well, that's not important, but that is. And one of your expectations may not be accepted, and therefore you become disappointed. So let's assume that you are clear about your expectations. Let's assume you've communicated those. Let's assume that people understand them, and let's assume they accept them. Surely that's it. But no, we've got more. Question 5 is, are my team members committed to meeting those expectations? Now, this is a big deal because just because they accept them doesn't mean they're committed to them. For example, often people have got 10 or 15 hats or, balls in the air that they're juggling at once. They may well assume that your expectation is, or, whatever it is, that's sort of something that can be left by the wayside. I'll work on these other things. And what happens is by the close of business today, or whenever you wanted that job done, you find that it's not been done. And so therefore you start getting upset about, why people haven't met your expectations. Here's an important point. When you give somebody something to do and you explain it, just say this to them. Can I get your commitment to get this report done by the end of business today? Now, what you're looking for, of course, is a nod or a grunt or a yes. If you get a nod or a grunt or a yes, then you have got their commitment. Now, it doesn't mean they'll always follow through, but the chances are they'll follow through having made some non-verbal or verbal commitment to it. So there's nothing at all disrespectful about that. Let me just do that again and just tell me if this sounds disrespectful. Can I get your commitment to get this report done by the close of business today because it's important? Now, all of you can do that, and I think it's a good idea. Now, don't make the assumption that they've committed to doing it because they haven't. They haven't. You think they have, or you'd like them to have, but they haven't. So you've actually got to ask for that commitment sometimes. Okay. Number 6 on the list. So we've got 2 more questions that need to be considered. So just because you know what your expectations are, just because you've communicated them, just because people understand them, and just because people accept them, and just because people are committed to them, doesn't necessarily end the whole managing of expectations. Because question 6 is, do your team members know how they're performing against those expectations? So this is about feedback. This is about you giving clear, regular, constructive feedback to people. And people need to know whether or not they're meeting or matching your expectations. So it's important, because if you don't do that, then you'll find that people may have the assumption that, your expectation isn't all that important, because you never actually give me any feedback about whether I'm meeting it. So think about it that way. All right, so just because you know your expectations and you communicated it and people understand it and people accept it and they're committed to it and you've given feedback, there's one last question that's important, and it's this. Are you supporting your team to achieve those expectations? Now, what I mean by that is there's all sorts of organisational roadblocks that will get in the way of people actually meeting expectations. So your job is to do what you can to remove the constraints on people so that they can, in fact, meet your feedback, meet your expectations. So, in your conversation with people, you might ask, what's getting in the way here? And that's a fair and reasonable question to ask, or what's likely to get in the way. Okay, moving right along. So hopefully that has helped you to consider some of the issues around feedback. Or should I say, that's one of the things that to help you with expectations. So if you've got any questions or comments, I'm happy to hear those. Now, let's talk about some fundamentals around giving feedback. The first, and these are all important, and you can argue about which is more important, but this is pretty important. When you're giving feedback to people, the key thing for you to do is to try to give it as quickly after the event or the incident or whatever it is that you're giving feedback on, as soon as possible. And the reason's pretty straightforward, isn't it? If you give feedback to people as soon as it's possible, then you're sending a very clear signal to the other person that it's important that this be done in a certain way. On the other hand, if you left it for 6 months or 6 weeks or something, and you said to the person, oh, look, I really enjoyed your presentation the other day when we had the clients in the room. I thought it was great. And I really didn't get a chance to talk to you 6 weeks ago, but just want to let you know that. Well, sure, they probably appreciate that, but it doesn't mean much, because they're thinking in their mind, if it was that good, surely you would have found the time to have given me that feedback at the time, so it's not really helpful. So as soon as possible. Now, we're all busy people, so therefore it's not always a simple case of just downing tools and giving feedback. But the principle is, as soon as possible, give the feedback, because the more it's done after the event, or at least closer to the event, the more likely that person is to take on the feedback and take it seriously, because you have set a priority around that by actually using, by coming back to them as soon as possible. Hopefully that makes sense, and I hope you can see the value in that. So it basically means that you won't always know. I mean, when you come to work, you don't know that you'll be giving feedback to somebody that day, or you probably know that, but you don't know what it's going to be about. And it might be likely that something will occur and then you give the feedback. So you've got to think carefully about, you've just got to be on your toes and ready to be giving that feedback when it's needed. All right, so what's the next thing on the list? The next thing on the list is you need to be very specific about your feedback. It's no good generalising and say, oh, that was a great presentation this morning, or great report, or I thought you handled that person on the phone really well. Now, all of those things are fairly generalised. So what you've got to do is be very specific about what it is that you're giving feedback about, and that's important. So, in fact, sometimes it might even be useful for you to sit down with pen and paper and actually write down what it is that you're wanting, So you're separating the behaviour from the person, and that's the critically important thing here. The more specific it is, the more powerful it will be, or relevant, because the more specific it is, the more the person can latch on to that expectation. Let me give you some examples around that might be helpful for you. Let's look at an example. So here is an example. So if I said this to you, so I'm sitting in a meeting with you, let's say it was this morning, so let's say my timing was right and I sat down with you over lunch and I said to you, overall, good job with the presentation at this morning's meeting, but it could have been better. Now, what would you think? You're probably thinking, oh, what did I do wrong? What's this about better? Wow, what do I do? And of course, if you're feeling comfortable, you may well ask me, but you may not. You may just walk away wondering. And so there's something wrong with that. It's not specific enough. So perhaps there's a better way for us to say it. Perhaps I could say it this way. And just down the bottom there, it'll come up on your screen. There we go. What about if I said, great job at the presentation. I really liked how you used statistics to back up your key points. One small comment. Maybe for next time, it would be a good idea to invite more comments from the group to get them more involved. Now I can do something with that. I know what the person giving that feedback liked about it. They liked the fact that I used statistics to back up my key points. I also have taken away something constructive about it that is useful for me in the future, and that is that I probably need to engage people a little bit more in the presentation. So you can see that that's far more helpful and far better received than the first one, which is too general. So get your timing right, and then when you give the feedback, be very specific about what it is that you're giving the feedback about. And by doing that, it'll be far more authentic. Now, I'll just stop there for a moment. Has anyone got any questions or comments? Anything that's come up that you... Normally what happens with the Lunch and Learn is people are usually quite quiet in the first. It's a bit like a workshop, isn't it? It's no different. People are very quiet and they're sussing it all out, and then you can't shut people up later, which is good. But I think I've got a question here now, which is great. I'll just open it up and have a look at it. Okay, so what is your take on feedback to groups and individuals? Okay, that's an interesting question, Fraser. So now, the first thing you've got to ask yourself the question here is, is this feedback specific to a person, or is it feedback to a team? Because if you're giving feedback to a person but you're doing it under the guise of a team, then that's not good. So you've got to ask yourself the question. So, for example, if there's a team or a group that aren't performing, generally they're not meeting their expectations and their marks, I would have a tendency perhaps to talk to the group about my expectations, but then I'd probably also try and have a series of one-on-ones with each team member so that I could talk to them individually about what they can do to contribute to that expectation. So my view about that, Fraser, is that I'd probably be inclined to do both. The trouble with group feedback, if you think about it, is that, let's say you have a team meeting and you get everyone around the table. The trouble with that, I think, is that if you give that feedback to the group at the time, everyone's sitting there going, oh, I'm really pleased Tim's done that. because, so-and-so next door to me needs to hear that. And the person sitting next door is thinking, oh, I'm really pleased that Tim said that because so-and-so next door to me needs to hear that. In other words, no one's actually taking on board the feedback. So my general take on that is it's okay to give group feedback, but I think at the end of the day, the most powerful feedback is actually the feedback that you give individually, because the person, there's nowhere to duck and hide, is there? They have to look at that as well. So Fraser's following it up and saying, is it okay to give individual feedback in front of a group? No, it's not okay. I would never, ever do that. And because if you do that, then what you're doing is, well, look, it depends on what the feedback is. I guess that makes a point. But no, I think feedback's a very private thing. Even if, look, let's just take an example where you think it might be great. And I think this is what you're getting to, Fraser. If I had some really positive feedback to give to somebody, okay, really positive, like they're a new client, we've had a new client or whatever, and they're an introvert, so they just quietly go about their business. They're not interested in being the centre of attention. Now, if I did that in front of everybody, as an example, as you pointed out, I might embarrass the person. Now, you got to remember that by doing that in the corridor and to the person, it's going to be just as, if not more effective than it would be in a group situation. So not everybody likes to be made the centre of attention, notwithstanding your point that that's a way of explaining to everyone what we want. So my inclination is no. And I find that some managers will do this because they want to, well, as you point out, set an example, or perhaps they want to show that they're good and generous managers and willing to give feedback at the right time. I think just do it one-on-one. It's far safer and it'll be no less effective. And in many cases, for those quiet people that do not want to be made, the centre of attention, it'll probably be even more effective. I hope that's helped, Fraser, with that question. Okay, let's move on. So if we are doing this immediately after the event and we're specific, we also should be doing it frequently. So the whole idea is that feedback should be ongoing, never ending. It should happen moment by moment, issue by issue, situation by situation. And that becomes extremely important, that it's not, thanks Fraser, appreciate your feedback. So those things must happen all the time. Now, look, the key thing is that every one of you in this broadcast, I think it'd be fair to say, has probably done a course, a university, you might have done a trade or something, you've done some sort of learning. And what traditional learning teaches you to do is to answer questions. So, for example, if you're an engineer, you learn how to solve problems. And so you can answer those questions. If you are, a consultant, you learn to respond to clients' problems. So the idea of asking questions is quite foreign, because it's more likely that you're in the business of answering questions. But for feedback, what I'm strongly suggesting you do is, before you launch into your feedback, what you should do is just ask them how they thought they went. You can do that in a very genuine way. Just say, how did you think that all went? And then you could say, perhaps, what do you like about it? And then you could say, what would you have done differently next time? That's very powerful. And then, of course, you can leverage off that. And if you agree with them, let them know, yeah, spot on. It's really great that we both agree on that. How can I help you get from A to B next time? If it's different, you can say, well, I've got a different point of view. I've got a different way of looking at this. Let me tell you what I think. All right. So try to get them engaged in the feedback process before you jump in and give your feedback, because you're engaging them in the conversation by using questions and also you're trying to get them to accept the responsibility of their own expectations, if you like. And of course, if they're madly different to yours, then you can talk about that. All right, moving right along. Fraser asked some great questions about this, and at the end of the day, I think feedback should be done in private. I think that both positive and constructive feedback should be done in private. I know that there are many people who do not like being made the centre of attention. I don't mind it, and probably you don't either, but it doesn't mean that everybody likes it. Some people just feel really uncomfortable when they're made the centre of attention. So just tell them to their face. As I said, it's going to be more effective. So don't bother making a song and a dance about it, because the main thing is the person that's done the job gets the feedback. That's the key thing, not whether we have a morning tea around it or whatever. Just let them know. Now, the other thing that I think is important is that when you're giving feedback to people, use critical incidents. Now, what I mean by that is that, use the examples or illustrations or whatever's going on at the time. So if somebody's upset with somebody and raises their voice in the office and you think that's inappropriate and you want to have a word to them, then of course you're going to use that incident to form your feedback, aren't you? If you had a visit to a client that didn't go very well, you'll use that example. So the more you can use critical incidents, that's why I think it's very good to do these feedback immediately after the event, because there's fresh in your mind and their mind is a critical incident that you can use to debrief on. So use those examples as much as you possibly can. Okay, we've just got Caroline's asking, I read somewhere that employees are frustrated when recognition is done in private, as if it's secret. What are your thoughts about this? Look, if it's genuine, Caroline, if it's done genuinely and it's done, authentically, that you're doing all the things here, how could it possibly be disappointing? The only thing that could be disappointing about it is that it's not done enough. If you look someone in the eye, you sit down with them and you actually give them feedback by saying, thank you, you did a fantastic job this morning. I really enjoyed the way you engaged that client in the problem. And you showed some great skill with the questions you asked. And I just want to let you know that I'm really impressed. How could they possibly be frustrated about that? Because you'd have to ask yourself the question, why would they want that feedback to be given in front of everybody else, for example? I mean, there's probably some good reason for that. But my view is just give the feedback, and you're not going to go wrong. The only way you go wrong with this stuff is if you don't give any feedback. Then you will get people who are very frustrated. So I'm not sure where you read that, but I kind of look. It's safer. All I'm saying is give it, and don't worry about having the big ceremony or having it at a morning tea, or you don't need to go there. Okay, because some people don't feel comfortable with it. Hopefully that's helped you, Caroline. Let's move on. Sorry, I don't know whether it's Caroline or Carolyn, so I apologise if I'm messing that up, okay? The other thing about feedback that's important is that you should remember that it's all about the future. So when you're giving feedback to people, it's only for two reasons. One is to change the behaviour or modify it in the future, or two is to reinforce and make sure that that behaviour is sustainable in the future if it's positive feedback. So when people want to wallow around in the issues and talk about, past events and everything else, the focus for you ought to be on the future, what's next and how we're going to apply it. So just keep that in mind, that it's not really about the past. The past informs the future, but the feedback is about actually creating the future, if you like. Now, I've just got a couple more slides to get through before we finish up, and I just want to talk about the difficult conversations, around, where people are likely to get upset. Now, the important thing is when you give feedback, and this is more around the constructive feedback, it's not a reason to argue. I mean, I think you know that, but look, you don't get into an argument with people. It's really important. There's two key ways of stopping yourself doing that. One is to say to the other person simply, I refuse to argue with you about this, and you've closed it down. Or if it's a minor point, perhaps in the scheme of things, you could say to the person, look, let's just agree to disagree. Okay, so it's, you've got a couple of choices there with that. So don't argue with people. Focus on performance. It's not about the person, it's about their performance. So you separate the person from the performance, and that's why a critical incident is really important to use. You very much focus on the future and talk about how this is going to change or be maintained in the future is very important. And try to balance it up, talk about strengths. And look, the most basic thing that you can do there is say to someone, I really believe that you'll get this right, and I'm confident that that'll be the case. Because you're being a hypocrite if you don't say that, because why are you giving people feedback if you're not confident that they're going to change? I mean, it just doesn't make sense. So if you're giving people feedback, you are doing that on the assumption that you believe that things can improve. And if you believe that, then you must let people know that, and that's a positive that you can walk away with. Sometimes things are quite complex and you need to actually, ask a lot of questions so you can get to the root cause. What things appear on the surface isn't necessarily the case. So there's some thoughts, some more guidelines for you before we wrap up. When you're having feedback on a difficult issue, get to the point. This is not a time for chit chat or gossip, you just get straight to the point, because the other person's thinking to themselves, what do you want to talk to me about? And then you're put in this position where you've got to answer them. So just get straight to the point. This is not like a conversation over lunch. So get straight to the point. Now, you don't have to be hostile about it, but just get straight to the point. And what you do is you explain the purpose of the meeting. That's the way to do it. The purpose of the meeting is to talk to you about the incident that just occurred in the lunchroom and our reactions to that and how we might remedy that for the future. I mean, I just did that off the spur of the moment, but you can give it some thought. The person's clear about that. Now, the important thing for you after you've explained what it is that you want to talk to them about is to bite your tongue until it bleeds and give the other person a chance to comment. So the sooner you get them talking, the better, because once they're talking, you can, catch your breath, think about what you have to say next, and you're engaging them in the feedback session. And the important thing is when they're talking, you must not interrupt them. You mustn't do that. Now, of course, people say all sorts of misleading things. They say things that are inaccurate. They say things that are provocative. But you mustn't, at any circumstance, jump in and cut them off and correct them. You don't do it. I'll tell you why. You wait until they've finished and they've drawn breath, and then you say to them, look, there's a couple of things that I'd like to comment on that you just spoke about. And then you go in and you say what you want to say, but you wait until they're finished. Why? Because you're going to start talking in a minute, and you don't want them interrupting you, do you? And of course, if they do, you can then say to them, well, look, I gave you the opportunity to say your bit. I'd appreciate the same courtesy. It's simple as that. So it's all about respect. Okay, I've got some homework for you. Isn't that exciting? Look, you've probably worked out it's going to be on feedback. Now, this is the homework. And look, it's not going to be onerous, but I just simply want you, that's you, to give positive feedback 3 times every day for a week, right? So we're talking 15 bits of positive feedback during the week, starting perhaps this afternoon. In fact, starting this afternoon. I want you to find 3 things this afternoon and comment on them positively. And I want you to do that again on Monday and then Tuesday and goes on. In fact, I'd like you to do it every day for the rest of your time in a leadership role. But I guess you've got to get into the habit of doing it. Now you might say, oh gee, there aren't really anything really all that much I can comment on. There's lots of stuff going on in your workplace that's positive. Lots of stuff. All you've got to do is look for it. And, you know, a lot of the feedback could just simply mean saying thank you. I mean, we don't do that enough, but actually walking up to saying thanks. I really appreciate the way you jumped in at the meeting this morning when I was obviously under a bit of pressure. You know, whatever. That's feedback. Okay, so it's not going to be hard for you to do this, but I want you to get into the rhythm of doing this, and you'll be amazed at the difference it'll make. I kid you not, it'll make an incredible difference. Remember those graphs around engagement I showed you earlier on in the webinar? That's what it's about. So, folks, we've got a few minutes, so happy to entertain any questions you've got, any comments, any observations, anything at all. Yep, good. I like this group. It looks like you guys aren't a shy bunch, which is great. Before giving negative feedback, do you believe in asking permission before delivering it? You're asking some great questions, Fraser. I think, okay, let's look at this. If you are their boss, then I don't think you need to ask their permission for it, because obviously you believe it's important enough. You go ahead and do it. What happens if they said no? Well, not that they're likely, but I understand that. However, here's the thing. If that happens to be your boss, then I would strongly suggest then that you ask permission. That's courtesy, and it's also catching them at the right moment. Okay, so this is upward feedback. Hopefully that's helped you. Dominique asks, I really struggle when I ask someone how they went and they think they went fantastic. I get stuck with where to go from there. Do you have any tips? Well, I think, yeah, I do, Dominique. I think what I would be saying to them is not, you're asking too broad a question. I used that before, but say to them, what was positive about what happened? Now, of course, they're going to have no problem filling that out. And then you say to them, okay, what's the one thing you would have done differently? Now, there's always something, isn't there? Now, it just puts them on the spot, doesn't it? Try that question. It's not pushy. If there's one thing you could have done differently, what would it be? Great question. Try that, Dominique. I'm sure you'll find that useful. And hi, anyway, it's been a while since we're caught up. When I think it went pretty poorly, yeah, look, and then, of course, you can then chime in, can't you, and sound and say, look, I agree with you, or there's something else that I think you need to perhaps think about, and then you jump in. So don't ask the broad thing because, oh yeah, it went really well, because they're not really thinking much, are they? So anyway, hopefully that works. Okay, anything else? Gosh, that's good. I've got a great bunch of people who want to engage, which I really enjoy. One of the shortcomings of this technology, of course, is that I can't eyeball you in a room, can I? So it's up to you to be involved. So thank you for being involved. It's great. So folks, that's it from me. I want you all to have a outstanding weekend. If I know some of you might be working, so apologies if that's the case. And we'll meet again in a couple of weeks. Keep your eyes out for the email from me, which of course will have the slides and the recording as well. So thanks everyone, and we'll catch up in a couple of weeks' time, and look forward to doing that. Thank you, and goodbye, and thanks for your involvement today. It's been really appreciated. Thanks, and see you later. Bye.